So let's look at 3.2. The most important thing is our essential question. We want to see what we're going to be dealing with today. And you need to underline parallel lines because that is our big concept. Parallel lines, we've been talking about the transversals and the pairs of angles that are made. Pairs of angles are congruent, which ones. But now we're going to focus mostly on parallel. And there's two things you need to write out. With parallel lines, you're going to have two options. You're going to have an option that's congruent, or you're going to have an option that they add up to 180. Those are the only two options. That's what's so great about this section. There's only two choices. Either the angles are going to be the same, or they're going to add up to 180. With parallel lines, that's what happens. So let's take a look at the very first pair down here, corresponding angles. Notice the parallel symbols. Okay, that's parallel. Notice the angles that they shaded in. They're called corresponding. We know corresponding angles are in the same position. They're called same position angles. And they are congruent. They're a congruent pair. They're always going to equal because they're identical angles. If I took 1, 2, 3, 4 and put them on top of 5, 6, 7, 8, 1 and 5 would land on each other perfectly. They'll be the exact same. Notice how they're both acute. 1 is acute, 5 is acute. They're both acute. That means they're equal because there's only two choices, equal or add up to 180. It's only two things you've got here. Nothing else, just equal or 180. So let's look at alternate interior. They're exactly what they say they are. They're alternating sides and they're in between two lines, interior. So they showed you two of them, 3 and 5. They're also a congruent pair. They're going to be two angles that are always the same. Your other pair of alternate interiors would be 2 and 8. They would both be the two obtuse angles that are an alternate interior. They're alternating sides. They're in between the two parallel lines. Notice how you circle the parallel symbols. If you look at letter C on the next page, alternating exterior, exactly what they sound like. They're alternating sides and they're outside. So you see 1 is acute, 7 is acute. Your other pair would be 4 and 6. They are also a congruent pair. So far, all the pairs have been congruent because they're always the same shape. They're either both acute or both obtuse. But when you get to consecutive interior, that's your one pair that you're going to get an obtuse angle and an acute angle. Unless, of course, they're both 90s, but in this case, they're not. As long as your lines are parallel, when you get consecutive interior, they're going to add up to 180. So they're going to be my 180-degree pair. 180-degree pair. So that's the four pairs. Okay, now you could also use consecutive exterior. They're also going to be 180 because one's going to be a big one, one's going to be a small one. But let's look at the essential question now. It says, when two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, which of the resulting pairs are congruent? So one of them we said was corresponding. So corresponding angles were congruent. Alternate interior angles were congruent. Alternate exterior angles were also congruent. The only ones that weren't congruent was consecutive interior. Those were the ones that added up to 180. So if you look at the next question down here, number 4, it says in exploration number 2, the measure of angle 1 is 80 degrees. So let's go back to the very first picture where the corresponding angles were. It's right on this page right here. They're telling us that angle 1 is 80. Do you know what the rest of the angles now have to be? The answer is yes. Because the parallel lines, that means 3 is also 80. That means 4 is going to be 100 because they have to add up to 180 with 3, linear pair. This one's going to be 100. And because of the alternate interiors and correspondings and stuff, this one's also 80 then, and because the parallel lines. This one's going to be 80 down here, this one's going to be 100, and this one's going to be 100. You see how any two angles you choose are either going to equal or they're going to add up to 180. That's your only two choices. You could pick any two numbers. Either you're going to get two equal angles or you're going to get two angles that add up to 180. So that's what happens when you have parallel lines. So that would be your communicate. If you look at the vocab, it's just really super brief. Corresponding angles, same position, and put congruent because they're always going to be congruent. Parallel lines are going to have the same slope. They're going to always go the exact same direction. Supplementary angles, we already know that they add up to 180. So any two angles you pick that are not congruent, that add up to 180, you could call them supplementary. And then vertical angles are always congruent. Come on. And you could draw an X. These two are vertical, and these two are vertical. And that's just your vocab. They're quick and easy ones. The theorems. Let me tell you what a theorem is first, real quick. A theorem is a proven statement. We are allowed to use theorems in our proofs because theorems are already proven statements. So all the things I just told you about corresponding angles being congruent, that's a theorem. It's true. Corresponding angles are always congruent. Okay, all the things I told you about alternate interior angles, that is also showing that they're also congruent. That's a theorem. Alternate interior angles are congruent. It's been proven that any alternate interior angle pair is congruent. And same thing with alternate exterior angles. They're also congruent angle pairs. They have to be congruent angle pairs. So those are all theorems. And the fourth theorem is on the next page. You can see that consecutive interior angles are supplementary, meaning they add up to 180 degrees. So you could put that on both sides here. Those two are going to add up to 180. Those two are going to add up to 180. Consecutive interior, and it's all because of these little parallel symbols. Because the lines are parallel, those two have to add up to 180. So always look for the parallel symbols. It's only parallel if it says they're parallel. If it doesn't say they're parallel, you cannot assume they're parallel. All right, number 1 on the extra practice. 1 and 2, they want us to find those two angles. So I would say that angle 1 is going to be 110, the same as the angle 110 because they're alternate interior. Okay, so those guys are alternate interior. The 110 and the 100, and then 2 is also 110 because these two are vertical. So those two angles are vertical angles, 1 and 2. So that's why it has to be 110. What do you think all the small angles in that picture are? They're all going to be 70s, every single one of them, because they're going to make the other ones add up to 180. So it has to be 70. So you could fill all the big ones as 110 and all the small ones as 70 if you'd wanted to. Number 2, they want us to solve for angles 1 and 2. So they're giving me a small angle that's 63. Okay, so which other one out of the 1 and 2 is another small angle? 1 is. So 1 is going to be 63. These two are corresponding angles. Corresponding. Corresponding angles are both in the lower right corner of their group. Now I can look at angle 2 with 63 and say I know those two have to add up to 180 because they are consecutive interior, or you could call them same side interior. And they're going to add up to 180, so this has to be 117, so that what adds up with 63 to equal 180. Has to be 117. Number 3, you've got 95 degrees, and angle 1 is also 95 because they're vertical. Vertical angles are always the same angle. And then 95 and 2 are going to be the same because they are corresponding. Corresponding angles. So corresponding angles are also always congruent. Always. Number 4. Angle 1 has to be 101 degrees because it's a vertical angle. And 2 has to be 101 degrees because they are corresponding. So they're either going to equal or they're going to add up to 180. That's our only two choices. And it also works to when we solve for algebra problems, when we solve for expressions, when we try to find the value of x. This one just says solve for x. So either those two angles are going to equal or those two angles are going to add up to 180. Look at 110 is obtuse. X plus 12 is also obtuse. That means they're alternate exterior and they are going to equal. Alternate exterior angles are always the same. If they're both obtuse, they're going to equal. So you would just subtract 12. You're going to get x is 98. So I would put those as equal because they're alternate exterior. They're both obtuse. They're both obtuse. They have to equal. Number 6, they're both acute. They're both acute and they're called alternate interior. So they're also going to equal. 10x minus 55 has to equal 45. They are equal angles. Those two angles together have to be equal because they are both acute. So I would add 55, and that's going to give me 10x equals 100. And when you divide by 10, x is going to be 10. Number 7, I don't know why they put a 6 in there, but look at the 4x. The 4x is very large, obtuse angle. And then look at the 52. It's a small acute angle. An obtuse angle and an acute angle cannot equal. One's bigger than 90, one's less than 90. So those two have to add up to 180. So you got to take the 4x angle, you got to add it to the 52 degrees, and it'll equal 180 because one's bigger and one's smaller in the two angles. So if you subtract 52, you get 4x is 128. If you divide by 4, you get x is 32. So if you plugged in a 32 to that x, your big angle would be 128, your small angle is 52, they would add up to 180. So they have to add up to 180. If they're not the same, they're going to add up to 180. And same thing with number 8. Number 8, they're saying that the vertical angles are equal and then that these two are going to add up to 180. So that means that our two angles are going to add up to 180 because one's small and one's big. 2x minus 3 plus the 153. Those two angles together have to equal 180 because one is really big. One's a big obtuse angle. The other's really small, acute angle. They must add up to 180. So you combine your like terms. 2x plus 150 equals 180. If you subtract 150 on both sides, you get 2x is 30. And then when you divide by 2, you get x is 15. So that is how fast you could do your homework tonight. That is section 3.2.